This excerpt is from 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus by Charles C Mann, circa 2006. Chapter 2, Why Billington Survived. Page 54, The Place of the Skull. According to family lore, my great-grandmother's great-grandmother's great-grandfather was the first white person hanged in North America. His name was John Billington. He immigrated aboard the Mayflower, which anchored off the coast of Massachusetts on November 9th, 1620. Billington was not among the company of saints, to put it mildly. Within 6 months of arrival, he became the first white person in America to be tried for harassing the police. Two of his sons were no better. Even before landing, one nearly blew up the Mayflower by shooting a gun at a keg of gunpowder while inside the ship. After the Pilgrims landed, the other son ran off to live with some nearby Indians, leading to great consternation and an expedition to fetch him. Meanwhile, Billington Pierre made merry with other non-Puritan lowlifes and haphazardly plotted against authority. The family was, quote, one of the profanest in Plymouth colony, complained William Bradford. Its long-serving governor, Billington, in his opinion, was a knave, and so shall live and die. What one historian called Billington's troublesome career ended in 1630 when he was hanged for shooting somebody in a quarrel. My family has always claimed that he was framed, but we would say that, wouldn't we? Growing up, I was always tickled by this raffish personal connection to history. Part of the Puritans, but not actually puritanical. As an adult, I decided to learn more about Billington. A few hours at the library sufficed to convince me that some aspects of our agreeable family legend were untrue. According to Billington, was in fact hanged. At least two other Europeans were executed in North America before him, and one of them was convicted for much more than interesting offense of killing his pregnant wife and eating her. My ancestor was probably number 3, and there is a whisper of scholarly doubt about whether he deserves to be even that high on the list. I had learned that Plymouth in school, but it was not until I was poking through my scattered references to Billington that it occurred to me that my ancestor, like everyone else in the colony, had voluntarily enlisted in a venture that had him arriving in New England without food or shelter 6 weeks before winter. Not only that, he joined a group that, so far as known, set off with little idea of where it was heading. In Europe, the Pilgrims had refused to hire the experienced John Smith as a guide on the theory that they could use the maps in his book. In consequence, as Smith later crowd, the hapless Mayflower spent several frigid weeks scouting around Cape Cod for a good place to land, during which time many colonists became sick and died. Landfall at Pawtucket did not end in their problems. The colonists had intended to produce their own food, but inexplicably neglected to bring any cows, sheep, mules, or horses. To be sure, that the Pilgrims had intended to make most of their livelihood not by farming, but by catching fish for export to Britain. But the only fishing gear the Pilgrims brought was useless in New England. Half of the 102 people on the Mayflower made it through the first winter, which to me seemed amazing. How did they survive? In his history of Plymouth Colony, Governor Bradford himself provides one answer: robbing Indian houses and graves. The Mayflower hove to first at Cape Cod. An armed company of pilgrims staggered out. Eventually, they found a deserted Indian habitation. The newcomers, hungry, cold, sick, dug open burial sites and ransacked homes, looking for underground stashes of food. After 2 days of nervous work, the company hauled 10 bushels of maize back to Mayflower. Carrying much of the booty in a big metal kettle the men had stolen, and, quote, sure it was God's good providence that we found this corn, Winslow wrote, for else we know not how we should have done. The Pilgrims were typical in their lack of preparation. Expeditions from France and Spain were usually backed by the state, and generally staffed by soldiers accustomed to hard living. English voyages, by contrast, were almost always funded by venture capitalists who hoped for a quick cash out. Like Silicon Valley in the heyday of the internet bubble, London was the center of a speculative mania about the Americas. As with the dot-com boom, a great deal of profoundly fractured cerebration occurred. Decades after first touching the Americas, London's venture capitalists still hadn't figured out that New England is colder than Britain, despite being further south. Even when they focused on a warmer place like Virginia, they persistently selected as colonists people ignorant of farming, multiplying the difficulties. The would-be colonizers were arriving in the middle of a severe multi-year drought. As a result, Jamestown and other Virginia forays survived on Indian charity. They were utterly dependent and therefore controllable. In the phrase of Karen Ordahl Kupperman, a New York University historian, the same held true for my ancestors' crew in Plymouth. Inexperienced in agriculture, the Pilgrims were also not woods people. Indeed, they were so incurious about their environment that Bradford felt obliged to comment in his journal when Francis Billington, my ancestor's son, climbed to the top of a tall tree to look around. As Thoreau noted with disgust, the colonists landed at Plymouth on December 16th. But it was not until January 8th that one of them went as far away as 2 miles. And even then, the traveler was again Francis Billington. A party of immigrants to California or Oregon, Thoreau complained. With no less work on their hands and more hostile Indians, would do as much exploring in the first afternoon, and the Serrier chaplain would have sought an interview with the savages, and examined the country as far as the Connecticut River, and made a map of it before Billington had climbed his tree. Huddled in their half-built village that first terrible winter, the colonists rarely saw the area's inhabitants, except for the occasional shower of brass or claw-tipped arrows. After February, glimpses and sightings became more frequent. Scared, the Pilgrims hauled 5 small cannons from the Mayflower and then placed them in a defensive fortification. But after all the anxiety, their first contact with the Indians went surprisingly easy. Within days, Tisquantum came to settle among them, and then they heard his stories. No record survives of Tisquantum's first journey across the Atlantic, but arithmetic gives some hint of the conditions in Hunt's ship. John Smith had arrived with two ships and a crew of 45. If the 2 ships had been of equal size, Hunt would have sailed with a crew of about 22. Because Hunt, Smith's subordinate, had the smaller of the 2 vessels, the actual number was surely less. Adding 20 or more captured Indians thus meant that the ship was sailing with at least twice its normal complement. Tisquantum would have been tied or chained to prevent rebellion and jammed into whatever dark corner of the hole was available. Presumably, he was fed from the ship's cargo of dried fish, which took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic to England. There is no reason to think Hunt went faster. The only difference was that he took his ship to Malaga on Spain's Mediterranean coast, where he intended to sell all of his cargo, including the human beings. The Indians' appearance in this European city surely caused a stir. Not long before, Shakespeare had griped in The Tempest that the populace of the much bigger city of London would not give a doit to a lame beggar, but will lay out 10 to see a dead Indian. Hunt managed to sell only a few of his captives before local Roman Catholic priests seized the rest. The Spanish church vehemently opposed brutality towards Indians. Pope Paul III, 1537, claimed that Indians themselves indeed are true men and should not be deprived of their liberty and reduced to our service like brute to animals. The priest intended to save both Tisquantum's body by preventing enslavement and his soul by converting him to Christianity. It is unlikely that Tisquantum was converted, though. It's possible that he allowed the friars to think that he had been. In any case, this resourceful man convinced them to let them return home, or rather, to try to return. He got to London, where he stayed with John Slaney, a shipbuilder with investments in Newfoundland. Slaney apparently taught Tisquantum English while maintaining him as a curiosity in his townhouse. Meanwhile, Tisquantum persuaded him to arrange for passage to North America on a fishing vessel. He ended up in a tiny British fishing camp on the southern edge of Newfoundland. It was on the same continent as Pawtucket, but between them were 1,000 miles of rocky coastline and the Mycamic and Abenaki alliances, which were at war with one another. Because traversing this unfriendly territory would be difficult, Tisquantum began looking for a ride to Pawtucket. He extolled the bounty of New England to Thomas Dermer, one of Smith's subordinates, who was then staying in the same camp. Dermer, excited by Tisquantum's promise of easy wealth, contacted Ferdinando Gorges, a long-time slightly dotty enthusiast about the Americas, promised to send a ship over with the men, supplies, and legal papers necessary for Dermer to take a crack at establishing a colony in New England. Dermer with Tisquantum was supposed to meet the ship when it arrived in New England. One Edward Rowcraft captained the ship sent by Georges from England. According to the Georges' principal biographer, Rowcraft appears to have been unfit for such an enterprise. This was an understatement. In a bizarre episode, Rowcraft sailed to the Maine coast in the early 1619, promptly spotted a French fishing boat, seized it for supposedly trespassing on British property, North America, placed its crew in chains aboard its own ship, and sent it back to Georges. With the prisoners, continued his journey on the smaller French vessel, which led to a mutiny, quelled the mutiny, stranded the mutineers on the Maine coast, discovered that without the mutineers, he didn't have enough people to operate the captured ship, and B, it was slowly filling up with water from leaks, and decided to sail immediately for British colony in Jamestown, Virginia, which had the facilities to repair a hull, a course that entailed skipping the promised rendezvous with Dermer at Jamestown. Rowcraft managed, though inattentiveness, to sink his ship not long after he was killed in a brawl. Incredibly, Dermer failed to execute his part of the plan, too. In orthodox comedy of error style, he did not wait for the Rowcraft in Maine, as he was supposed to, but sailed back to England, to Squantum in tow. The two ships more or less crossed paths in the Atlantic. Dermer and Squantum met personally with George. Evidently, they made an excellent impression, for despite Dermer's proven inability to follow instructions, George sent him back with Squantum and a fresh ship to meet Rowcraft, who was supposed to be waiting for them in New England. Dermer touched land in Maine and discovered that Rowcraft had already left. On May 19, 1619, still accompanied by Tisquantum, he set out for Massachusetts, hoping to catch up with Rowcraft, which he didn't know that Rowcraft had sunk his own ship. What Tisquantum saw on his return home was unimaginable. From southern Maine to Narragansett Bay, the coast was empty, utterly void, Dermer reported. What had once been a line of busy communities was now a mass of tumbled-down homes and unattended fields overrun by blackberries. Scattered among the houses and fields were skeletons bleached by the sun. Slowly, Dermer's crew realized that they were sailing along the border of a cemetery, 200 miles long and 40 miles deep. Pawtucket had been hit with a special force. Not a single person remained. Tisquantum's entire social world had vanished. Looking for his kinfolk, he led Dermer on a melancholy march inland. The settlements they passed lay empty to the sky, but full of untended dead. Tisquantum's party finally encountered some survivors, a handful of families in a shattered village. These people sent for Massasoit, who appeared, Dermer wrote, with a guard of 50 armed men and a captive French sailor, a survivor of shipwreck on Cape Cod. Massasoit asked Dermer to send back the Frenchmen, and then he told Tisquantum what had happened. One of the French sailors had learned enough Massachusetts to inform his captor before dying that God would destroy them for their misdeeds. The Nazet scoffed at the threat, but the Europeans carried a disease, and they bequeathed it to their jailers. Based on accounts of the symptoms, the epidemic was probably viral hepatitis. According to a study by Arthur Spies of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and Bruce Spies of the Medical College of Virginia, the strain was like hepatitis A, probably spread by food contamination rather than sexual content, like Hep B or C. Whatever the cause, the results were ruinous. The Indians died in heaps as they lay in their houses. The merchant Thomas Morton observed in their panic, the healthy fled from the sick, carrying the disease with them to neighboring communities. Behind them remained the dying, left for the crows, kites, and vermin to prey upon. Beginning in 1616, the pestilence took at least 3 years to exhaust itself and killed as much as 90% of the people on the coast of New England. And the bones and skulls upon the several places of their habitations made such a spectacle, Morton wrote, that Massachusetts woodlands seemed to be a new-found Golgotha, the place of the skull, where executions took place in Roman Jerusalem. The religious overtones in Morton's metaphor are well placed. Neither the Indians nor the Pilgrims had our contemporary understanding of infectious disease. Each believed that sickness reflected the will of the celestial forces. As the writer and historian Paula Gunn Allen put it, the idea that the realm of the spirits or the supernatural was powerfully engaged in the day-to-day life of the nations, as well as of villagers, was commonly held on both sides of the Atlantic. Both Indians and Europeans predicted events by the positions of certain stars in the elliptical plane around the Earth, as much as by visionary techniques, and both assumed the reality of the malicious as well as beneficent supernaturals. The only real question in the minds of either side was whether Indian spiritual forces could affect Europeans and vice versa. As an experiment, Cotton Mather, a celebrated New England minister, tried to exorcise the demons in a possessed young woman with incantations in Massachusetts. To his satisfaction, the results demonstrated empirically that Indian magic had no effect on Christian devils. Unlike the sickness, Massasoit had directly ruled a community of several thousand and held sway over a confederation of as many as 20,000. Now his group was reduced to 60 people and the entire confederation to fewer than 1,000. The Wampanoag, wrote Salisbury, the Smith historian, came to the obvious logical conclusion, quote, their deities had allied against them. The Pilgrims held similar views. Governor Bradford is said to have attributed the plague to, quote, the good hand of God, which favored our beginnings by sweeping away the great multitude of natives, that he might make room for us. Indeed, more than 50 of the first colonial villages in New England were located on Indian communities, emptied by disease. The epidemic, Georges said, left the land without any people to disturb or appease our free and peaceable possession thereof, from when we may justly conclude that God made the way to effect his work. Much as the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which killed 10,000 in one of Europe's richest cities, prompted spiritual malice across Europe, the New England epidemic shattered the Wampanoag sense that they lived in balance with an intelligible world. On top of that, the massive death toll created a political crisis. Because the hostility between the Wampanoag and neighboring Narragansett had restricted contact between them, the disease had not spread to the latter. Massasoit's people were not only beset by loss, they were in danger of subjugation. After learning about the epidemic, the distraught Tisquantum first returned with Dermer to southern Maine, apparently concluding he was never going to meet Rowcraft. Dermer decided in 1620 to make another pass at New England. Tisquantum returned too, but not with Dermer. Instead, he walked home, the long, risky journey he had wanted to avoid in the interim. Yet another English expedition had attacked the Wampanoag, killing several without apparent provocation. Understandably enraged, Indians attacked Dermer with several times on his journey south. He was eventually slain on Martha's Vineyard by another former Indian abductee. For his part, Tisquantum was seized on his journey home, perhaps because of his association with the hated English, and sent to the Massasoit as captive. As he had before, Tisquantum talked his way out of a jam. This time he extolled the English, filling Massasoit's ears with tales of their cities, their great numbers, their powerful technology. Tisquantum said, according to the colonists who knew him, that if Tisakam could make the English his friends, then any enemies yet were too strong for him. In other words, the Narragansett would be constrained to bow to him. The Sachem listened without trust. Within a few months, word came that a party of English had set up shop at Pawtucket. The Wampanoag observed them suffer through the first punishing winter. Eventually, Massasoit concluded that he possibly should ally with them. Compared to the Narragansett, they were lesser of two evils. Still, only when the need for a translator became unavoidable, he did allow Tisquantum to meet the pilgrims. Massasoit had considerable experience with the Europeans. His father had sent Martin Pring on his way 17 years before, but that was before the epidemic, when Massasoit had the option of expelling them. Now he told pilgrims that when he was willing to leave them in peace, a bluff one assumes, since driving them away would have taxed his limited resources. But in return, he wanted the colonists assistant with the Narragansett. To the pilgrims, the Indians' motive for the deal were obvious. They wanted European technology on their side. In particular, they wanted guns. He thinks we may be of some strength to him, Winslow later said. For our pieces, guns are terrible to them. In fact, Massasoit had a subtler plan. It is true that the European technology dazzled Native Americans on the first encounter, but the relative positions of the two sides were closer than commonly believed. Contemporary research suggests that the indigenous peoples of New England were not technologically inferior to the British, rather that terms like superior and inferior did not apply to relationships between Indian and European technology. Guns are an example, as Chaplin, the Harvard historian, has argued. New England Indians were indeed disconcerted by their first experiences with European guns. The explosion and smoke, the lack of visible projectile, but the natives soon learned that most of the British were terrible shots from lack of practice. Their guns were little more than noisemakers. Even for a crack shot, a 17th century gun had fewer disadvantages over a longbow than may be supposed. Colonists in Jamestown taunted the Powhatan in 1607 with a target they believed were impervious to an arrow shot. To the colonists' dismay, an Indian sank an arrow into it a foot deep, quote, which was strange, being that a pistol could not pierce it. To regain the upper hand, the English set up a target made of steel. This time, the archer burst his arrow into all pieces. The Indian was in a great rage, and he realized, one assumes, that the foreigners had cheated. When the Powhatan later captured John Smith, Chaplin wrote, Smith broke his pistol rather than reveal to his captors the awful truth that it could not shoot as far as an arrow could fly. At the same time, Europeans were impressed by American technology. The foreigners, coming from a land plagued of famine, were awed by maize, which yields more grain per acre than any other cereal. Indian moccasins were so much more comfortable and waterproof than stiff, moldering English boots that when colonists had to walk for long distances, their Indian companions often pitied their discomfort and gave them new footwear. Indian birch bark canoes were faster and more maneuverable than any small European boat. In 1605, 3 laughing Indians in a canoe literally paddled circles around the lumbering dory paddled by traveler George Weymouth and seven other men. Despite official disapproval, the stunned British eagerly exchanged knives and guns for Indian canoes. Bigger European ships with sails had some advantage. Indians got a hold of them through trade and shipwreck and trained themselves to be excellent sailors. By the time of the epidemic, a rising proportion of the shipping traffic along the New England coast was of indigenous origin. Reading Massasoit's motives at this distance is a chancy business, but it seems likely that he did not want to ally with the foreigners, primarily for their guns, as they believed, although the Sacan doubtless relished the possibility of additional firepower. He probably wanted more to confront the Narragansett with the unappetizing prospect of attacking one group of English people, at the same time that their main trading partners were of English people. Faced with the possibility of disrupting their favorite position as middlemen, the Narragansett might think twice before staging an incursion. Massasoit, if this interpretation was correct, was trying to incorporate the Pilgrims into the web of native politics. Not long before Massasoit has expelled foreigners who stayed too long in Wampanoag territory. But with the entire Confederation now smaller than one of its former communities, the best option seemed to be allowing the Pilgrim to remain. It was drastic, even a fatal decision. Page 65, Machinations. Tisquantum worked to prove his value to the Pilgrims. He was so successful that when some anti-British Indians abducted him, the colonists sent out a military expeditions to get him back. They did not even stop to ask themselves why he might be making himself essential. Given how difficult it must have been to live in the ghost of his childhood home, in retrospect, the answer seemed clear. The alternative to staying in Plymouth was returning to Massasoit and renewed captivity. Recognizing that the Pilgrims would be unlikely to keep him around forever, Tisquantum decided to gather together the few survivors of Pawtucket and reconstitute the old community at a site near Plymouth. More ambitious still, he hoped to use his influence on the English to make this new Pawtucket the center of the Wampanoag Confederation, thereby stripping the Sackhamship from Massasoit, who had held him captive. To accomplish these goals, he intended to play the Indians and the English against each other. The scheme was risky, not the least, because the ever suspicious Massasoit sent one of his niece, Hobomok, to Plymouth as a monitor. Sometimes the two men were able to work together, as when Hobomok and Tisquantum helped the Pilgrims negotiate a treaty with the Massachusetts to the north. They also helped establish a truce with the Nauset of Cape Cod after Bradford promised to pay back the losses caused by their early grave robbing. By the fall, the settler situation was secure enough that they held a feast of Thanksgiving. Massasoit showed up with 90 people, most of them young men with weapons. The Pilgrim militia responded by marching around and firing their guns in the air in a manner intended to convey menace. Gratified, both sides sat down, ate a lot of food, and complained about the Narragansett. Thanksgiving. All the while, Tisquantum covertly tried to persuade other Wampanoag that he was better able to protect them against the Narragansett than Massasoit. In case of attack, Tisquantum claimed that he could respond with an equal number of Indian troops and the Pilgrims who might be able to intimidate the enemy. He evidently believed that the Narragansett did not have enough experience with European guns to know that they were not as fearsome as they first appeared. To advance his case, Tisquantum told other Indians that the foreigners had hidden away casefuls of the agent that caused the epidemic, and that he could manipulate them into unleashing it. Even as Tisquantum attempted to foment Indian distrust of Massasoit, he told the colonists that Massasoit was going to double-cross them by leading a joint attack on the Plymouth with the Narragansett, and he attempted to trick the Pilgrims into attacking the Sachem. In the spring of 1622, Tisquantum accompanied a delegation to Massachusetts and Boston Harbor. Minutes after they left, Bradford later recalled one of the surviving Pawtucket came running in seeming great fear to inform the settlers that the Narragansett, he thought also Massasoit, were planning to attack. The idea clearly was that the colonists, enraged by the putative assault, would rise up and smite Massasoit. Tisquantum would be away, so his hands would seem clean. Instead, everything went awry. In Indian villages, people could only be summoned by shouting. Once a canoe had gone a few hundred yards, it could not readily be called back. But when the news came of the impending attack, Bradford ordered the Pilgrims to fire a cannon to order back the expedition and Tisquantum. Meanwhile, Hobomok, who had acquired some English, indignantly denied the story, in a move that Tisquantum apparently had not anticipated. Bradford had dispatched Hobomok's wife to Massasoit's home to find out what the Sachem was doing. She reported that all was quiet. Actually, this wasn't entirely true. Massasoit was furious at Tisquantum. He demanded that the Pilgrims send their translator to him for a quick execution. Bradford refused. Tisquantum's language skills were too vital. Tisquantum is one of my subjects, Massasoit said. You Pilgrims have no jurisdiction over him, and he offered a cachet of fur to sweeten the deal. When the colony still would not surrender Tisquantum, Massasoit sent a messenger with a knife and told Bradford to lop off Tisquantum's hands and head to make his displeasure manifest. He summoned Hobomok home and cut off contact with the Pilgrims. Nervous, the colonists began building defensive fortifications. Worst, almost no rain fell between mid-May and mid-July, withering their crops. Because the Wampanoag had stopped trading with them, Pilgrims would not be able to supplement their harvest. Tisquantum, afraid of Massasoit's wrath, was unable to take a step outside of Plymouth without an escort. Nonetheless, he accompanied Bradford on a trip to southeast Cape Cod to negotiate another pact. They were on the way home when Tisquantum suddenly became sick. He died in a few days in hopes and ruins. In the next decade, tens of thousands of Europeans came to Massachusetts. Massasoit shepherded his people through the wave of settlement, and the pact he signed with Plymouth lasted for more than 50 years. Only in 1675 did one of his sons, angered at being pushed around by colonists' laws, launch what was perhaps an inevitable attack. Indians from dozens of groups joined in. The conflict, brutal and sad, tore through New England. The Europeans won. Historians attribute part of the victory to Indian unwillingness to match the European tactic of massacring whole villages. Another reason for the newcomers' triumph was that by that time they outnumbered the natives. Groups like the Narragansett, which had been spared by the epidemic of 1616, were crushed by smallpox epidemic of 1633. A third to half of the remaining Indians in New England died. The people of the First Light could avoid or adapt to European technology, but not to European disease. Their societies were destroyed by weapons their opponents could not control and did not even know they had.